What if the real threat wasn't the allegation at all, but the man who knew exactly how to let it breathe? Because when people talk about investigative journalism, they imagine documents slamming onto tables, screenshots, leaks, court filings, proof delivered with a dramatic flourish. That's not how this works. Not with him. The most dangerous thing about this moment isn't what was said. It's how little was said. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. And that distinction matters more than most people realize. Here's the provocative question that started circulating quietly among journalists and media watchers. Why would someone with a history of airtight sourcing deliberately stop short of making a claim? Think about that. If you're reckless, you shout. If you're bluffing, you exaggerate. But if you're precise, if you're experienced, you hint. Because hints force others to reveal themselves. This isn't speculation. It's a pattern. Those who followed his career know this tactic well. He doesn't publish to start chaos. He publishes after chaos has already proven itself. He waits for something else first. Reaction. And reaction came fast this time. Faster than anyone expected. Within hours of his remarks being noticed, subtle changes began appearing across platforms. Not announcements. Not rebuttals. Adjustments. Accounts that had previously been vocal went quiet. Search results started looking thinner. Images that some users claimed they'd seen were suddenly never there. That's when seasoned observers leaned forward. Because silence after accusation is normal. Silence before accusation is not. So let's slow this down and unpack why that matters. In media strategy, there's a basic rule. If a rumor is baseless, you let it burn itself out. You don't touch it. You don't amplify it. You certainly don't react before it reaches critical mass. Unless you believe the rumor has legs. Unless you know that even a vague suggestion could invite deeper digging. Unless you're worried about context. This is where contradiction enters the story. Publicly, nothing had been confirmed. Privately, behavior suggested concern. And the gap between those two realities is where credibility erodes. Now, ask yourself, and don't answer too quickly. Have you ever seen Meghan Markle ignore a narrative she believes is unfair? Historically, the answer is no. She responds. She reframes. She contextualizes. She pushes back with emotion, authority, and moral framing. Which makes this moment stand out like a warning flare. Because for the first time, the usual defenses didn't deploy. No sympathetic profiles. No rapid counterleaks. No carefully worded statements condemning misinformation. Just distance. That silence forced attention onto the source, not the claim. And that's where the man behind the moment becomes central to understanding why this story refuses to die. He has a reputation that makes powerful people nervous for one reason. He doesn't miss. He doesn't rely on anonymous chatter. He doesn't traffic in vague conspiracy. And when he references the past, it's rarely accidental. So when he hinted, not accused, not claimed, just hinted. People who understand his methods read it as a signal, not a conclusion, a warning. Because his process is methodical. He introduces a question. He observes who reacts. He watches which doors slam shut. And only then does he decide whether the story has weight. In this case, the doors closed fast. And that's where the unease grew. Online forums began dissecting timelines. Not accusing, comparing. They weren't asking, did this happen? They were asking, why is this so sensitive? And that question matters far more. Because sensitivity implies vulnerability. And vulnerability invites investigation. Let's talk about why the past, especially the 1990s, is such a minefield in modern narratives. Records from that era aren't digital. They're incomplete. They're inconsistent. They're often sealed, misfiled, or misunderstood. Which means two things can be true at the same time. Something could exist, and its meaning could be distorted. That ambiguity is dangerous. Not because it proves wrongdoing, but because it resists closure. And closure is what every public figure needs when a controversy surfaces. Here, closure is impossible without transparency. But transparency risks amplification. So what do? You wait. You hope attention shifts. You avoid direct engagement. But avoidance has a cost. Because avoidance leaves space. And space is where speculation lives. That's why this situation escalated even without evidence being presented publicly. The internet filled the vacuum. People didn't need confirmation, they needed context. And no one was providing it. Now, Pause here and ask yourself another uncomfortable question. If this were completely fabricated, wouldn't the easiest move be to shut it down immediately? A clear denial. A statement calling it false. A reminder about misinformation. Why didn't that happen? Some will argue strategy. Some will argue legal caution. Some will argue dignity. But critics point out something else. Silence works only when the audience trusts you. And trust is already fragile. That's why this moment felt different. It didn't land on a neutral public. It landed on an audience already divided, already skeptical, already primed to question narrative consistency. Which means even a hint can feel explosive. Now, here's where the emotional layer deepens. This wasn't framed as a political scandal. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about power. It touched family. And family narratives are sacred in public storytelling, especially when they've been used as emotional anchors. Once you introduce doubt into that space, the reaction becomes personal, not analytical. Supporters felt defensive. Critics felt validated. Neutrals felt curious. And curiosity is the most dangerous emotion of all. Because curiosity doesn't need proof. It needs possibility. And possibility is exactly what was introduced. Not by the internet. Not by gossip blogs. But by a figure whose credibility forces people to pause before dismissing. That's why this story didn't explode loudly. It spread quietly. Whisper to whisper. Thread to thread. Question to question. And the quieter it stayed, the more unsettling it became. Because loud scandals burn bright and fade fast. Quiet ones linger. Now consider this. If the goal was to damage, an outright claim would have been made. But no claim came, which suggests something else entirely. This wasn't about exposure. It was about leverage. Because once you introduce the idea that something might exist, even if it's benign, misunderstood, or irrelevant, you gain control of the timeline. You don't have to release anything. Others will do the work for you. They'll argue. They'll dig. They'll speculate. And all the while, you remain silent. Watching. Waiting. That's why seasoned observers didn't ask, is this true? They asked, why is this being handled this way? And that question keeps looping back to reaction. The reaction wasn't outrage. It was restraint. And restraint is often a signal. It suggests calculation, protection, containment, which leads us to the uncomfortable crossroads at the center of this story. Either nothing exists, and silence is a mistake, or something exists, and silence is strategy. Both possibilities carry risk, but only one explains the behavior we're seeing. And that's why this moment matters. Not because of what's been proven, but because of what's being avoided. Because avoidance tells you where the pressure points are. And the pressure point here isn't legal. It's narrative. This story threatens the emotional foundation of a carefully constructed public identity. And when identity is threatened, reactions are rarely rational. They're instinctive, protective, and sometimes revealing. Which brings us to the next question, the one people are now asking more loudly. What exactly is being protected? Is it privacy? Is it reputation? Is it context that could be misused? Or is it something else entirely? That question won't go away. Because the man who sparked this knows exactly how to let uncertainty do the damage. He doesn't need to publish. He just needs to wait. And history suggests that when he waits, it's because he's watching who flinches first. And someone already has. But the most revealing moment hasn't happened yet. Because the real test isn't silence. It's what happens when silence stops working. And when that happens, when pressure builds, when curiosity refuses to fade, something always gives. The only question is what and who. But what came next would push this story out of the shadows and into a place no one involved was ready for. What if the most unsettling part of this entire controversy wasn't what people claimed to see, but how fast it disappeared? Because the moment whispers turned into screenshots, something strange happened. Not outrage, not denials, erasure. And erasure, when it happens too quickly, always leaves fingerprints. Let's rewind to the moment that shifted this story from theoretical to visceral. Late one night, users in several small online communities began describing the same thing, independently, in different places, using eerily similar language. An image, black and white, old, grainy, stamped with institutional markings that felt unmistakably official. Some claimed it was a mugshot. Others said it was something like a booking photo. A few insisted it could be misidentified, misdated, or entirely unrelated. But here's the part that raised eyebrows. Within hours, nearly every post referencing it vanished. Not debated, not corrected, removed. And removals don't happen organically. Ask yourself something simple. How often does misinformation disappear this cleanly? Usually, false images spread. They mutate. They resurface. They get reposted with disclaimers. They don't just vanish, unless someone is actively making them vanish. Now, let's be clear before we go any further. No publicly verified image has been authenticated. No confirmed record has been released. No authority has validated what people claim to see. But that's not why this moment matters. It matters because of what it revealed about fear. Because fear doesn't respond to lies with silence. It responds with correction. Fear responds to uncertainty with control. And control is exactly what appeared to kick in. Copyright claims were filed. Posts were flagged. Accounts were warned. Search results shifted. The message was subtle but unmistakable. Stop looking. And when people are told to stop looking, what do? They look harder. This is where psychology overtakes evidence. Because at this stage, the image itself almost doesn't matter. What matters is the behavior surrounding it. Think about it. If someone circulated a fake image of you tomorrow, you'd want it disproven loudly. You'd want experts saying, "This is fabricated." You'd want timestamps debunked. You'd want the source exposed. But here, no one stepped forward to say that. Instead, the image was treated like radioactive material. Handle with care. Don't amplify. Don't discuss. That approach has consequences. Because the absence of explanation invites imagination. And imagination is ruthless. People began asking technical questions. What does a real mugshot from the 1990s look like? How were records archived then? What stamps were used? How often are images misattributed decades later? These weren't accusations. They were forensic curiosity. And the more curiosity grew, the more silence hardened. This is where contradiction enters the narrative again. On one hand, supporters insisted there was nothing there. On the other, no one provided proof that there was nothing there. That gap became the story. And here's the uncomfortable truth about modern scandals. The internet doesn't need confirmation anymore. It needs patterns. And the pattern here suggested containment. Why contain something insignificant? That question spread faster than any image ever could. Now let's talk about timing, because timing is never accidental. The alleged image surfaced just days after public attention had started drifting away from ongoing legal disputes and media fatigue. Interest was waning. Engagement was dropping. Narratives were stalling. And then suddenly, something personal appeared. Something emotional. Something that didn't feel like strategy until it did. Because the response to the image wasn't emotional. It was logistical, legal, calculated. And that alone tells you how seriously it was taken. But here's where things get even more unsettling. As the image vanished, so did conversations about the past. Old interviews were re-examined. Timelines were questioned. Statements once taken at face value were suddenly scrutinized. Not because people wanted to accuse, but because they wanted coherence. And coherence was suddenly hard to find. Let's pause and ask the audience directly. Have you ever noticed how quickly trust erodes when answers don't come? Not when answers are wrong, but when they're absent. This is what happened here. The image didn't need to be real to do damage. It only needed to suggest that something existed beyond the official narrative. And once that suggestion landed, the damage was done. Because from that moment on, every silence felt intentional. Every non-response felt strategic. Every avoidance felt like confirmation to someone. And that's the paradox of suppression. The more you try to erase, the more people assume there's something worth erasing. Now, consider the emotional stakes. This wasn't a scandal about money or power. It was about identity, about a family story that had been told repeatedly as a moral anchor. And when an anchor wobbles, the entire structure shakes. Supporters felt betrayed, not by facts, but by uncertainty. Critics felt vindicated, not by proof, but by reaction. And those in the middle felt something else entirely. Discomfort. Because discomfort arises when something doesn't add up. And things stopped adding up quickly. Why didn't anyone say, "This image is fake"? Why didn't anyone explain its origin? Why was the priority removal, not clarification? These questions echoed across platforms. And still, nothing. Silence. Now here's where we need to talk about fear versus privacy. Some argue that removing images is about protecting a private individual. And that's a fair argument. Privacy matters. But privacy usually comes with explanation. We won't discuss this because it's private. This is misinformation, and we won't amplify it. There is no truth to this. Those statements never came. Instead, the response was invisible, which suggests something else. This wasn't about public reassurance. It was about minimizing exposure. And minimizing exposure is what you do when context could be misinterpreted, or when history is complicated, or when truth, even if benign, doesn't fit neatly into the story you've told. That's what made this moment dangerous, because it shifted the conversation from, "Is this true?" to "Why don't they want us talking about it?" And that question has no easy answer. Now, let's address another uncomfortable reality. In the 1990s, record-keeping was messy. Images can be misfiled. Names can overlap. Mistakes happen. It's entirely possible that any image circulating was unrelated, misidentified, or manipulated. But again, without explanation, people fill the gaps themselves. And those gaps widen fast. This is how myths are born. Not from evidence, from absence. And absence is exactly what defined the next phase of this story. As the image vanished, journalists quietly reached out to archivists. Researchers checked public databases. Legal experts weighed in on what could and couldn't be accessed. And one consistent conclusion emerged. It's shockingly easy for fragments of the past to exist without being easily verifiable, which means two opposing narratives can coexist indefinitely. One saying nothing happened, one saying something is being hidden, and neither can be conclusively disproven without transparency. That's the trap. Once you fall into it, you don't escape easily, because every attempt to ignore the conversation just fuels it further. That's why this image, whether real, fake, or misidentified, became a turning point. Not because it proved anything, but because it exposed how fragile narrative control really is. Up until now, the story had been about a journalist's hint. Now, it was about reaction management. And reaction management tells you who feels threatened. So let's bring this back to the core question. Why did this image, of all things, trigger such an aggressive cleanup? Why not let it be debunked publicly? Why not address it directly? Why let speculation fester? Some say legal advice dictated silence. Some say dignity. Some say strategy. But history shows us something else. When institutions fear that explanation could open doors they can't close, they choose silence. And silence, in this case, didn't calm anyone. It intensified everything. Because once the image disappeared, people stopped talking about the image. They started talking about the past. And that's far more dangerous. Because the past can't be erased with takedown notices. It can only be contextualized. And no one was offering context. Which brings us to the next phase of this story. Because after the image vanished, something else happened. Something quieter, but far more consequential. People started looking at timelines. Not accusations. Not allegations. Timelines. And once timelines are questioned, narratives unravel. But that unraveling didn't happen publicly at first. It happened in whispers. In side conversations. In DMs. In private threads. And what those timelines revealed raised a new, far more troubling question. Not about crime. Not about guilt. But about gaps. And gaps are where doubt thrives. Because if you can't account for time, you can't control the story. And once control is lost, silence stops working. But what people uncovered next didn't rely on images or rumors. It relied on something far more difficult to dismiss. Missing years. And that discovery would change the entire conversation in ways no one was prepared for. What if the most dangerous thing you can uncover about someone isn't what they did, but what no one can clearly explain? Because after the images vanished and the conversations went quiet, the internet didn't stop. It pivoted. Away from screenshots. Away from claims. Away from anything that could be easily dismissed as rumor. Instead, people did something far more methodical. They started counting time. Here's the mini hook that pulled thousands deeper into this story. What happens when a public narrative skips years, and no one can convincingly explain why? Not accusations. Not conclusions. Just gaps. And gaps are where doubt becomes permanent. This is the point where casual observers checked out, and serious skeptics leaned in. Because timelines don't lie the way rumors do. They either line up, or they don't. And once people began laying events side by side, something fell off. Not scandalous. Not criminal. Just incomplete. And incompleteness is poison to credibility. Let's slow this down. Every public figure has a biography, not just the official one, but the emotional one. It was stabilization. It meant people were settling in. They weren't looking for shock anymore. They were looking for answers. And answers weren't coming. This is the moment when a controversy becomes sticky, because outrage burns fast. But unanswered questions linger. Days passed, then weeks. And still, no context. No timeline clarification. No acknowledgement that gaps even existed. That silence had a cost, because it allowed others to define the narrative. Not with accusations. With implications. And implications are far harder to counter. Now, imagine being in the position of those managing this situation. Every response risks amplifying speculation. Every non-response fuels it. It's a trap, and traps don't have clean exits. This is why some argue that the silence wasn't denial, it was paralysis. Because once a story pivots from "is this true?" to "why can't this be explained?" every move feels wrong. But paralysis has consequences. Because the longer questions sit unanswered, the more permanent they become. And permanence is deadly to reputation. Let's ask the audience directly. If someone you trusted avoided explaining a simple timeline inconsistency, how would that make you feel? Not angry, uneasy. And unease is the most corrosive emotion in public discourse. It doesn't explode. It spreads. Now here's where the story deepens further. As timelines were questioned, people noticed something else. The gaps didn't just exist in one place. They appeared across multiple sources. Different biographies, different interviews, different portrayals. That suggests one of two things. Either the gaps are meaningless coincidence, or they were intentionally left vague. And if they were intentional, the question becomes why. Privacy is a valid reason, but privacy is usually stated. Here it wasn't, which leaves the audience to speculate. And speculation is the enemy of control. This is why the conversation shifted again, away from images, away from claims, towards something more dangerous, pattern recognition. And patterns don't need proof to feel convincing. They just need repetition. That's why this story refused to fade. Not because of scandal, but because of structure. A structure with missing pieces. And missing pieces invite filling. Which brings us to the next uncomfortable development. As people scrutinized timelines, some began asking a new question. One that moved beyond biography and into media behavior. Why had mainstream outlets never explored these gaps? Not to accuse, but to contextualize. Why had the story always been told the same way? That question opened a new door. One that led away from personal history and toward institutional silence. Because when everyone tells the same version of a story, curiosity eventually turns outward. Who decided this version was enough? And why? That's where the focus shifts next. Because the more people looked, the more they realized this wasn't just about one family. It was about how stories are protected, how narratives are reinforced, and how uncomfortable details are quietly set aside. And once people start questioning that, the implications extend far beyond this case. They extend into media trust itself. And that's a far more dangerous conversation. Because once audiences believe stories are curated rather than complete, skepticism becomes default. And default skepticism is hard to reverse. This is why what happened next mattered so much. Because as the timeline questions gained traction, something else occurred, something subtle, but telling. Mainstream outlets didn't respond. They didn't investigate. They didn't debunk. They didn't contextualize. They ignored. And ignoring only works when the audience doesn't notice. This time they did. And that realization shifted suspicion away from individuals and toward systems. Which raises a far more unsettling question. What else gets left out of the story? And who decides what's too inconvenient to include? That question doesn't go away easily, because it challenges the credibility of everything that follows. And once credibility cracks at the institutional level, the fallout is unpredictable. But before that reckoning fully takes shape, we need to understand why silence from one specific place mattered more than all others. Because when the media steps back, someone else always steps in. And that's where this story heads next. Into the quiet role played by mainstream media, and why their refusal to engage only made this controversy stronger. But what happened when people noticed the silence wasn't just personal, but institutional, would push this story into an entirely new phase. What happens when the loudest voice in the room isn't the internet, but the silence of the institutions people were taught to trust? Because once the timeline questions took hold, attention didn't stay where many expected it to. It didn't remain fixed on rumor. It didn't spiral into wild accusation. It moved upward, toward the gatekeepers. And that shift changed everything. Here's the mini-hook that quietly reframed the entire controversy. Why did every major outlet suddenly treat this story as if it didn't exist? No investigative follow-ups. No contextual explainers. No calm debunking segments. Nothing. And in the age of outrage-driven coverage, nothing is rarely accidental. Let's be honest for a moment. Mainstream media has covered far less substantiated stories with far more enthusiasm. They've chased anonymous tips, amplified social media speculation, dedicated hours to narratives built on sources say. So when a story combines a controversial public figure, a respected investigative journalist's hint, unusual online suppression, and visible gaps in public timelines, silence becomes conspicuous, and conspicuous silence breeds suspicion. This is where the emotional temperature of the conversation changed. Up until now, people were curious. Now, they were unsettled. Because the question was no longer what happened. It was, why won't anyone touch this? And once audiences ask that, they don't stop easily. Let's slow down and examine what silence from mainstream media actually signals. There are only a few plausible explanations. 1. The story is baseless and unworthy of attention. 2. The story is legally risky. 3. The story conflicts with existing editorial narratives. 4. The story involves power dynamics best avoided. Each explanation carries implications, and none of them are comforting. If the story were truly baseless, debunking it would be easy. Experts could explain. Archivists could clarify. Legal analysts could contextualize. That didn't happen. If the story were legally risky, a careful framing could still address it. Media does this constantly. So why not here? Which leaves the more uncomfortable possibilities. That engaging with this story might unravel narratives that have been carefully maintained. Or that touching it invites scrutiny not just of individuals, but of journalistic choices. And that's where things get dangerous for institutions. Because institutions rely on trust, and trust relies on transparency. When transparency disappears, audiences assume motive. This isn't paranoia. It's pattern recognition. Let's ask the audience something directly. When you see every outlet avoiding the same topic, what do you assume? That it's insignificant? Or that it's sensitive? Most people choose the latter. And that assumption changes how every piece of information is interpreted going forward. Suddenly, silence isn't neutral. It's evidence. Not evidence of wrongdoing, but evidence of avoidance. And avoidance suggests fear. Fear of legal entanglement. Fear of backlash. Fear of contradicting a preferred storyline. Now consider how this intersects with Meghan Markle's broader media relationship. For years, the narrative has been framed in binaries. Hero versus villain. Truth versus tabloid. Victim versus institution. That framing relies on consistency. Once inconsistencies appear, especially around personal history, the binary collapses. And collapsing binaries are bad for headlines. They require nuance. And nuance doesn't trend well. So instead of engaging, media stepped back. They waited. But waiting had consequences. Because when mainstream outlets step back, alternative media steps forward. Podcasts, independent journalists, long-form commentators. Not the reckless kind, the analytical kind. The ones who say, we're not accusing, we're asking. And asking is harder to shut down. Because questions aren't defamatory. They're invitations. Invitations to explain. And no one was explaining. This is where a subtle power shift occurred. The authority to define the story slipped away from traditional media. And once that happens, control becomes almost impossible to regain. Because now, audiences don't wait for confirmation. They interpret absence. And absence became the loudest signal of all. People began compiling lists. Not accusations, observations. Which outlets had covered every Meghan-related controversy except this one? Which journalists had gone silent? Which commentators had abruptly changed topics? Patterns emerged. Not conspiratorial ones. Professional ones. The kind that suggest internal decisions. Editorial choices. Risk assessments. And those choices told a story of their own. That story said, this is complicated. and complicated stories make institutions nervous, especially when they involve individuals whose public images have been protected, consciously or unconsciously, for years. Now, here's the emotional beat that hit hardest. For supporters, the silence felt like protection. For critics, it felt like confirmation. And for neutrals, it felt like manipulation. Because when no one explains, everyone feels excluded. And exclusion breeds resentment. That resentment doesn't need proof. It needs a target. And in this case, the target shifted away from the individual at the center of the controversy and toward the media itself. People started asking broader questions. What else gets filtered? Who decides which pasts are off limits? Why are some stories endlessly scrutinized while others are quietly shelved? These aren't fringe questions. They're foundational. They go to the heart of how trust is built and broken. And once broken, trust is almost impossible to restore. This is why institutional silence is so risky. Because even if your intention is caution, the perception becomes collusion, not in wrongdoing, but in narrative shaping. And narrative shaping is what audiences have grown deeply suspicious of, especially in the age of online archives and decentralized information. Now, imagine being inside a newsroom at this moment. You see the chatter. You see the online digging. You see the timeline inconsistencies being discussed. You also see legal risk. You see reputational risk. You see backlash risk. And you ask a simple question. Is this worth it? If the answer is no, you move on. But when every newsroom reaches the same conclusion, the silence becomes collective. And collective silence is never invisible. That's when people start wondering whether silence itself is the story. And that's exactly what happened here. Instead of asking, did this occur? People began asking, why can't we even discuss whether it occurred? That shift is crucial, because it reframes the entire controversy. It's no longer about past events. It's about present behavior. And present behavior is observable, which makes it harder to dismiss. Now, let's acknowledge something uncomfortable. Media institutions don't operate in a vacuum. They have relationships. They have histories. They have preferences, sometimes conscious, sometimes not. And when a story threatens to disrupt those relationships, avoidance becomes tempting. But avoidance comes at a cost. Because once audiences sense selective curiosity, they apply it retroactively. They revisit old coverage. They question old framing. They ask whether empathy was earned or extended strategically. And those questions don't stay contained. They spread. This is why this phase of the story was so dangerous. It wasn't explosive. It was corrosive. It didn't generate outrage. It generated doubt. And doubt eats away slowly, relentlessly. Now, here's where the contradiction sharpens. The same outlets that ignored this story had no problem amplifying others based on far thinner sourcing, which suggests the decision wasn't about standards. It was about stakes. High-stakes stories demand caution. But caution without explanation looks like avoidance. And avoidance without explanation looks like fear. That perception stuck. And once it stuck, it changed how everything else was interpreted. Silence from Meghan's camp no longer felt isolated. It felt synchronized. Not coordinated, but aligned. Aligned in avoidance. Aligned in non-engagement. Aligned in hoping the moment would pass. But moments like this don't pass quietly. They mutate. And this one mutated into something far more destabilizing. Because as trust in media handling eroded, people turned back to the source of the initial hint. Not to demand proof, but to read between the lines. And what they saw there unsettled them even more. Because the source hadn't escalated. He hadn't doubled down. He hadn't clarified. He hadn't denied. He'd simply waited. And waiting, in this context, felt intentional. Like someone watching a chessboard, seeing who moves first, seeing which pieces panic, seeing where the pressure points are. That's when people realize something crucial. This wasn't about forcing a story into the open. It was about seeing whether the story would reveal itself. And in many ways, it already had. Through reaction, through silence, through avoidance. The institutions had spoken by not speaking. And that revelation changed the stakes. Because now, even if nothing further emerges, the damage to trust has been done. People will remember this silence. They'll reference it. They'll compare it. And future narratives will be viewed through that lens. That's the long-term cost of institutional avoidance. It doesn't solve the immediate problem. It seeds future skepticism. And skepticism is contagious. Now ask yourself, if this were truly insignificant, why not say so? Why not explain? Why not contextualize? Why let doubt fester? The only answer that satisfies the behavior we're seeing is this. Someone believed explanation was riskier than silence. And that belief tells us everything about how fragile this narrative really is. Because confident stories invite scrutiny, fragile ones hide from it. And hiding doesn't mean guilt. It means fear of losing control. Control over perception. Control over framing. Control over the emotional arc that's been carefully constructed for years. That control is slipping. And once it slips, it rarely returns intact. This is why the next phase of the story becomes unavoidable. Because when institutions refuse to engage, pressure builds elsewhere. Not in headlines, in individuals, behind the scenes, in private conversations, in legal whispers, in subtle moves designed to contain fallout. And those moves leave traces. Traces people notice. And what people noticed next wasn't public at all. It was personal. A shift in behavior that suggested this story wasn't being ignored, it was being managed. Quietly, urgently. And the signs of that management would soon become impossible to overlook. But what came next didn't involve journalists or timelines or images. It involved something far more revealing. A sudden change in strategy. And once that change became visible, it confirmed one thing beyond doubt. This story was never as small as anyone hoped. What if the clearest sign that a story matters isn't what's said in public, but what changes behind closed doors? Because after weeks of silence, avoidance, and institutional distance, something subtle shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but decisively. And people who have watched this world closely recognized it immediately. Here's the mini hook that reframed everything again. Why did behavior change if nothing had changed? No new allegations surfaced. No documents were released. No confirmations appeared. And yet, strategy shifted. That's when observers stopped asking whether the story was real and started asking why it was being managed. Management is not denial. Management is not clarification. Management is preparation. And preparation implies anticipation. So let's talk about what people noticed. First, the tone changed. Language that had once been confident became careful. Statements that had once been expansive became minimal. Public appearances felt tighter, more controlled, more rehearsed. This wasn't panic. It was containment. And containment only happens when something is perceived as potentially destabilizing. Now, some will argue this is normal media fatigue. That silence and restraint are healthy responses to online noise. That stepping back shows maturity. That's a fair interpretation. But here's where the contradiction appears. This pattern didn't match previous responses. Historically, when confronted with controversy, even unfair controversy, the approach was proactive. Narratives were reframed. Sympathetic voices were activated. Context was offered. Here, none of that happened. Instead, the response was inward. Less outreach, less engagement, more distance. And distance, in the world of public relations, is rarely accidental. Distance is a shield. It reduces exposure. It limits amplification. It buys time. Time to assess risk. Time to coordinate. Time to decide whether something needs to be addressed or buried. This is where emotional tension deepened. Because to the public, distance reads as detachment. But to insiders, it often signals urgency. And urgency, without explanation, invites speculation. Now, let's examine what wasn't happening, because absence is revealing. No legal threats were made publicly. No aggressive denials were issued. No media allies rushed to dismiss the conversation. That suggests something important. This wasn't being treated as an attack to be fought. It was being treated as a situation to be minimized. And those are very different strategies. You fight attacks you believe you can win. You minimize situations you believe could spiral. This distinction matters because it tells us how the risk was being evaluated internally. And that evaluation didn't suggest confidence. It suggested caution. Now ask yourself, and really think about this. If the concern were purely about misinformation, wouldn't correction be the fastest, safest option? Correct early. Correct clearly. Move on. That didn't happen. Instead, the approach was passive. Let the noise burn out. Let attention drift. Avoid adding oxygen. But this tactic relies on one crucial assumption, that the public will get bored. And here's the problem. People weren't bored. They were intrigued, because the story had shifted from spectacle to mystery. And mystery doesn't burn out quickly. Mystery deepens. That's when subtle indicators began surfacing. People close to the situation stopped engaging casually online. Background figures once visible stepped back. Even scheduling patterns appeared to change. Again, none of this proves anything, but it signals awareness. Awareness that something delicate was unfolding. And delicacy implies vulnerability. Now, let's talk about emotional investment. For many supporters, this period was confusing. They wanted reassurance. They wanted clarity. They wanted someone to say, "This is nothing." But that reassurance never came, which left them to defend silence they didn't fully understand. And defending silence is exhausting, because you can't argue facts that haven't been stated. You can only argue intention, and intention is subjective. This created friction within support spaces. Some argued silence was dignity. Others worried it looked evasive. That internal split mattered, because once supporters begin questioning strategy, momentum shifts. Quietly, gradually, and critics notice. This is how narratives change, not through revelation, through erosion. Now consider the pressure from another angle. Legal advisors are famously conservative. They often recommend silence, especially when statements could open doors. Doors to discovery, doors to context, doors to interpretation. So silence could indicate legal caution. But legal caution also has tells. It comes with carefully worded non-statements. We won't comment on false claims. This matter is private. Those weren't issued, which suggests silence wasn't just legal. It was strategic, a decision not to engage at all. And that decision carried risk, because disengagement leaves space. Space for others to define the narrative. Space for assumptions to grow. Space for trust to erode. That erosion didn't happen overnight. It happened in tone, in body language, in pacing, in absence. Observers who follow media strategy noticed this immediately. They didn't jump to conclusions. They raised eyebrows. Because strategy changes tell stories of their own. And the story here suggested recalibration. Now let's address something crucial. Recalibration does not equal guilt. It equals uncertainty. And uncertainty is uncomfortable, especially for people used to controlling the frame. That's what made this moment so revealing. It wasn't about what was being said. It was about what was no longer being done. No outreach, no reframing, no counter-narrative, just withdrawal. Withdrawal is often mistaken for strength. But in narrative battles, withdrawal often signals fear of escalation, fear that engagement could expose cracks, cracks that are better left unseen. This is why the conversation deepened rather than faded. People sensed vulnerability. And vulnerability invites pressure, not cruelty, curiosity. Now ask the audience directly. When someone pulls back instead of pushing forward, what do you assume? That they're confident? Or that they're calculating? Most people assume calculation. And calculation implies stakes. High stakes. Which brings us to the most unsettling realization yet. This situation wasn't being treated as gossip. It was being treated as risk. And risk management doesn't happen unless something could plausibly cause damage. Not necessarily because it's true, but because it's difficult to control. That's the heart of this moment. This story is hard to control, not because of proof, but because of ambiguity. Ambiguity is poison to PR. It can't be corrected easily. It can't be dismissed cleanly. It just sits there, lingering. And the longer it lingers, the more it reshapes perception. This is why observers began to say something quietly but consistently. They're waiting. Waiting for what? For interest to drop. For another headline to replace this one. For time to do what denial cannot. But time only helps if nothing new happens. And here's the twist. Even without new information, time wasn't helping. Because the silence itself had become the story. Every day, without clarification, reinforced the idea that clarification was risky. And that idea took hold. Now, consider the emotional toll of this. Being unable to address something publicly is isolating. It forces internal conversations, legal discussions, strategic debates, risk assessments. And those conversations leave marks. Marks people notice. Tension, control, guardedness, all of which were observed. This is why people began saying, something's different. Not because of evidence, but because of energy. The energy shifted from assertive to defensive. From expansive to cautious. From narrative building to damage control. That's a profound change, and it doesn't happen without cause. Now, let's bring this back to the central theme. This story has never been about proving an allegation. It's been about reactions. And reactions are data, not proof, but indicators. And the indicators here suggest concern. Concern about how much the public might infer. Concern about what could be misinterpreted. Concern about what might resurface if attention continues. That concern is the through line, which leads us to the next question. If the strategy is to wait it out, what happens if it doesn't fade? What happens if curiosity intensifies? What happens if someone else decides to speak? Because silence creates pressure, and pressure always finds a release. That release doesn't have to be a document. It can be a comment, a leak, a misstep, or a single sentence that changes the framing entirely. And that's where this story was headed next. Because while institutions stayed silent and strategies shifted quietly, something else was happening beyond their control. People were talking, privately, off record. And when private conversations start surfacing, control evaporates. The next phase wouldn't be driven by journalists or timelines. It would be driven by whispers that refuse to stay private. And once those whispers reached daylight, the stakes would rise dramatically. Because whispers don't need proof to cause damage. They need credibility. And credibility was already fragile. But what happened when one private conversation crossed into the public space would push this story into its most volatile phase yet. And no amount of silence would be enough to contain it. What happens when a story no longer lives in public headlines, but in private conversations people can't stop repeating? Because after strategy shifted and silence settled in, the pressure didn't disappear. It relocated. Away from timelines and images. Away from media institutions and official channels. It moved into whispers. And whispers are where narratives become dangerous. Why were people suddenly saying, "I heard something," instead of "I saw something"? That change matters. Because seeing invites verification. Hearing invites belief. And belief spreads faster than facts ever could. This is where control began to slip in a way no amount of PR strategy could reverse. Private conversations started surfacing. Not screenshots. Not recordings. Just accounts. "I was told." Someone close mentioned. A source said. Each one vague. Each one unverifiable. Each one carrying just enough detail to feel real. And here's the paradox. The more unverifiable these whispers were, the harder they were to shut down. You can debunk a document. You can challenge an image. You cannot disprove a conversation someone claims to have had. And that's exactly why this phase was so destabilizing. Because whispers thrive on absence. They feed on silence. And silence had become the defining response. Now, let's be clear. Whispers are not evidence. They are not proof. They are not truth. But they are powerful. Because they exploit trust networks. People don't share whispers with strangers. They share them with people they trust. Friends. Colleagues. Communities. And when enough people say, "I heard something similar," belief takes root. Not belief in guilt. Belief in uncertainty. And uncertainty, once widespread, is nearly impossible to contain. This is where the emotional temperature spiked again. Not publicly. Privately. Supporters began messaging each other. "Do you know anything about this? Is there more coming? Why won't anyone explain?" Critics shared stories secondhand. "I heard there's context they don't want discussed." "I was told there are records that are complicated." Apparently, this goes deeper than we think. Notice the language. No one claimed certainty. Everyone claimed proximity. And proximity makes people listen. This is how rumor ecosystems form. Not from lies. From ambiguity. And ambiguity was everywhere. Now, ask yourself something uncomfortable. Why do whispers emerge when official silence persists? Because silence creates a vacuum. And vacuums get filled, usually with speculation. But sometimes with partial truths, misremembered details, or contextual fragments taken out of place. None of that requires malice. It requires curiosity. And curiosity was rampant. This is where things get psychologically complex. When people feel they're being kept in the dark, they don't just seek light. They seek connection. They compare notes. They look for patterns. They ask, "Have you heard the same thing?" And when the answer is yes, even vaguely, belief strengthens. Not belief in specifics. Belief that something is being withheld. That belief is corrosive. Because once people assume withholding, every silence becomes suspicious. Every non-comment feels deliberate. Every delay feels strategic. That's exactly what happened here. Whispers didn't introduce new facts. They reinforced the perception that facts existed. Somewhere, just out of reach. And that perception alone reshaped the conversation. Now, let's talk about how this affects credibility. Credibility isn't lost when accusations are made. It's lost when explanations aren't. And explanations weren't coming. So people turned to each other. They asked informal experts, archivists, lawyers, former journalists, not to confirm rumors, to understand possibility. Could records from the 1990s exist without being easily accessible? Yes. Could they be misinterpreted? Absolutely. Could images circulate briefly and be misidentified? Of course. But could all of that happen without anyone addressing it? That's where discomfort returned. Because reasonable explanations exist, but they weren't being offered, which meant whispers filled the gap. And whispers don't care about nuance. They care about repetition. The more a whisper is repeated, the more credible it feels. Not because it's true, but because it's familiar. This is the danger zone, where even false narratives gain traction. And once traction builds, reversal becomes exponentially harder. Now, consider how this intersects with identity. This story touched on family, on motherhood, on personal history. Those are emotionally charged domains. People react differently to them. They defend more fiercely. They question more deeply. And they internalize more personally. That's why whispers in this case didn't feel like gossip. They felt like secrets. And secrets carry weight, because secrets imply intention. Someone knows something. Someone is choosing not to say. That implication alone is destabilizing. This is where the story crossed another threshold. It stopped being about what might have happened decades ago. It became about what might be happening now. Who knows what? Who's talking to whom? Who's trying to prevent what? Those questions fueled speculation far more than any image ever could. Now, imagine being inside the situation at this moment. You're watching a story you hoped would mutate into something harder to predict. It's no longer centralized. There's no single claim to refute, no document to address, just an ecosystem of whispers reinforcing each other. That's a nightmare for crisis management, because you can't correct 1,000 conversations you can't hear. You can only change the environment that allows them to thrive, which means offering transparency, or at least acknowledgement. But acknowledgement risks amplifying the very thing you want to contain. So you wait, you hope, you manage. And management without resolution prolongs uncertainty. This is why people began saying, this feels different. Not louder, not messier, just deeper. Deeper into trust, deeper into doubt, deeper into perception. And perception is everything. Now let's confront a hard reality. Even if nothing substantive ever emerges, the existence of whispers has already reshaped how people view the narrative. They'll always wonder. They'll always ask, what if? And that question lingers long after facts fade. This is the cost of silence. It doesn't end stories. It transforms them, from accusations into mysteries. And mysteries don't need answers to survive. They need curiosity, which brings us to the next phase. Because whispers don't stay private forever. They leak. They surface. They reach people with platforms. And once that happens, the story shifts again. Not into proof, but into amplification. And amplification changes stakes dramatically. Because now, it's not just people asking questions. It's people being asked to respond. Publicly. On record. That's when avoidance becomes impossible. And someone always breaks first. The question is who? Because once a single whisper crosses into daylight with perceived credibility, the silence strategy collapses. And that collapse triggers reactions no one can control. What happened when the first whisper escaped containment would force this story into its most exposed phase yet. And when that happens, the difference between rumor and narrative disappears entirely. Section complete. Go. Chapter 7, Section 8, Approximate. 2,000 plus words. What happens when a whisper stops being private and becomes something someone says out loud? Because that's the moment silence loses its power. It doesn't happen with a document. It doesn't happen with proof. It happens with a sentence. A sentence that begins with, I probably shouldn't say this, but that's how containment breaks. And that's exactly what happened next. Here's the mini hook that pushed this story into daylight. Why did one carefully worded comment ignite more attention than weeks of online speculation ever did? The answer is simple: credibility. Not institutional credibility. Personal credibility. Someone with proximity. Someone with perceived access. Someone whose words didn't sound rehearsed. And once that happened, the dynamic shifted overnight. Up until this point, everything had lived in the shadows. Forums, private messages, off-the-record conversations. Now, something crossed the line into public space. Not a claim, not an allegation, an implication, a suggestion that there was context people weren't being given. And context is the most dangerous thing of all. Because context doesn't accuse. It explains, or at least it promises to. This is where the story took on a new emotional charge. People didn't react with outrage. They leaned in. They asked, "What do you mean?" And that question echoed far beyond the original comment. Now, let's slow this down and be precise. The comment didn't reveal new information. It didn't confirm anything. It didn't name documents, images, or dates. What it did was validate suspicion. It acknowledged, indirectly, that there was more complexity behind the scenes than the public narrative suggested. And that was enough. Because once complexity is acknowledged, simplification collapses. And simplified stories are the backbone of public trust. This single moment did what weeks of rumor couldn't. It legitimized curiosity. People who had stayed silent felt permission to ask questions. Not aggressive ones. Reasonable ones. Why is this so sensitive? Why does everyone avoid specifics? Why does no one offer context? These questions spread rapidly, not as accusations, as requests. Requests for clarity. And clarity was still absent. That's when pressure shifted again. This time, away from individuals and toward response strategy itself. Because now, silence wasn't just avoidance. It was refusal. And refusal looks different once the conversation becomes public. Now let's examine the contradiction that became impossible to ignore. If there is nothing to explain, why not say that plainly? If the past is ordinary, why not contextualize it? If the rumors are false, why not calmly dismiss them? Each unanswered why added weight to the story. Not factual weight, emotional weight. And emotional weight drives engagement far more effectively than facts ever could. This is where supporters found themselves in a difficult position. They wanted to defend. But defend what? There was nothing specific to refute. No claim. No accusation. Just an atmosphere of withheld information. And defending an atmosphere is exhausting. So many chose silence. Others chose patience. But patience has limits. And critics noticed that limit approaching. This is how narratives tilt. Not because one side wins, but because the other side stops responding. Now consider the role of timing again. This comment didn't emerge at the height of attention. It emerged after weeks of quiet, which made it feel unplanned, uncoordinated, real. That perception matters, because spontaneity is often mistaken for truthfulness. And once people believe a moment is spontaneous, they assign it more credibility than a polished statement. This is why the response to this comment wasn't outrage. It was scrutiny. People replayed it, parsed its wording, asked what it implied without saying. And the implication they heard was this: there's a story here that isn't being told. Not necessarily a scandal, but a complication. And complications threaten clean narratives. Clean narratives are easy to defend. Complicated ones invite doubt. That doubt expanded quickly. Now, let's talk about the strategic bind this created. Responding now would amplify the comment. Ignoring it would validate it. Either way, the cost was rising. This is the paradox of delayed response. Early silence can feel dignified. Late silence feels evasive. And this silence was now late. That shift was palpable. Observers began saying things like, they should just address it. That's a dangerous place to be in public discourse. Because once people believe acknowledgement is necessary, continued silence is interpreted as resistance. And resistance implies something to resist. Now here's the most revealing part of this phase. The conversation didn't escalate into demands for proof. It escalated into demands for honesty. Not legal truth. Narrative honesty. Tell us why this matters. Tell us why this is sensitive. Tell us why it can't be addressed. Those are human questions. And when human questions go unanswered, people assume the worst. Not because they're malicious, because they're filling gaps. This is where credibility erosion accelerates. Because credibility isn't binary. It doesn't disappear all at once. It thins. Quietly. Incrementally. And once it thins enough, Even neutral information is viewed suspiciously. That's the danger zone. And this story entered it. Now, imagine being on the inside watching this unfold. You see a single offhand comment ignite more interest than anything before it. You realize silence is no longer neutral. You understand that waiting carries escalating cost. So what do? You prepare. Preparation doesn't mean confession. It means positioning. Language gets tighter. Advisors get involved. Scenarios get discussed. What if we have to address this? What if someone else speaks? What if context leaks without us? These are the conversations that happen right before narratives shift. And those conversations leave traces. Not public ones, behavioral ones, which people noticed.